And welcome everyone to the, I guess officially this is the, our launch of social equity and racial justice. Let's see if I can, there we go. Seminar in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. I'm Kimberly Gray, the department chair, and I'm so happy to see so many of our students and faculty and people from across Northwestern. A special thanks to members of our external advisory board who are here. And you know, I didn't have this brainstorm until late yesterday that I should extend an invitation to you. So thank you so much for seeing this as a really interesting opportunity to learn more about equity and justice issues. So once again, welcome everyone. What I'm here to do is to just tell you that we are beginning to have, we are hoping to promote this conversation in our community by having a seminar at least once a quarter, where we explore how intrinsically equity and justice issues are to the practice of civil and environmental engineering. So we're very happy that Patty Loew is our first speaker in this series. I think that it's an excellent launch. We have high expectations of you, Patty, so thank you so much.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure, right. So on that note, I'm going to invite Erin Packman, Professor Erin Packman, to do the honors and introduce Patty, since they are colleagues who work together. And Erin, so good of you to beam in from the loop there. I like your background. So.
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly. Yes, I'm very happy to introduce Patty Loew as our first speaker in this seminar series. Patty is the director of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, or CNARE, at Northwestern, and also a professor in the Medill School of Journalism. She had come here from a long career in broadcast journalism in public and commercial television. Patty is also a citizen of Mashkiiziibi, the Bad River Band of the Lake Superior Ojibwe. And she has done extensive work with Native American youth, especially in the region, and teaching storytelling and journalism, science communication as a way to contribute to the growth of the next generation of Native land stewards. Patty is also an accomplished author. She has written 4 books and numerous articles that have appeared both in the public media and the peer-reviewed literature. And she's written on very diverse subjects, ranging from the history of Native Americans in Wisconsin to the Ojibwe 7th generation sustainability philosophy to more broad science education. And I'm very happy to turn this over to Patty and hear her description of some of the social justice or injustice issues faced by Native American communities.
Rich, thank you so much, Erin. I really appreciate it. So I always like to introduce myself the way I've been taught to. So Patty Loew, Indigenous, Mashkiiziibi, and Ojibwe, Mongdodem. My name is Patty Loew. In Ojibwe, Moan, in our language, it's torchlight on the water woman, which actually has a deeper sort of connotation and refers to spearfishing during the spring by torchlight on the lakes. I'm a member of the Loew clan, and my clan generally were the diplomats and speakers, ambassadors. So as a broadcast journalist, I kind of think that maybe I'm fulfilling my clan obligations. And Mashkiiziibi means medicine river. That's what we call our place. We don't think it's a bad river at all, but that's, we're not sure exactly how that, it was definitely lost in translation. So I really appreciate you inviting me to talk to you. It's not often I get to rub shoulders with computer engineers, and looking at everybody in these boxes, it seems like there's a joke there somewhere. How many engineers does it take to fill out a Zoom session? But I don't have the, I have the setup, but I don't have the punchline. So I hope I can share my screen. I'm going to exit here and see if I can call up my presentation. Let's see, where is it? There it is. Can everybody see this? Is everybody, okay.
Yep, good.
Yep.
So people, pipelines, and water protectors, Native American sacrifice zones. What do we mean by a sacrifice zone? Well, this is a pretty good definition that comes to us from Mulvaney from a book, Solar Power, Innovation, Sustainability, and Environmental Justice. A sacrifice zone is a geographic area that has been permanently impaired by environmental damage or economic disinvestment. The term is loosely used to describe marginalized places that bear the burdens of the industrial economy, purportedly to benefit society overall, as measured by abstract notions of progress or development. So I'm going to talk about 3 examples of sacrifice zones: the Alberta tar sands, the Black Mesa coal mining and coal slurrying, and the legacy of uranium mining, and Enbridge Line 5, which actually involves my community, Bad River. So the Alberta tar sands, you may know, is the world's largest industrial project. It is about the size of Florida in Alberta, Canada. About 20% is surface mining with deeper deposits requiring steam-assisted gravity systems, and the bitumen is heated and pumped to the surface. 120 oil sands projects are pumping 2.6 million barrels of diluted bitumen mixed with light crude oil and chemicals per day to US refineries. I gotta figure out how I can move this. I have the little, there we go. The screen sharing information at the bottom, it's covering up actually my what I see on my screen here. So the tailings waste ponds, and this is the real problem, containing arsenic, mercury, polycyclic, aromatic hydrocarbons, and other toxics found in the bitumen could fill 500,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The tailing ponds are leaking 11 million liters a day into the Athabascan River. And it's not unusual for indigenous fisher people who depend on the fish in the Athabascan River to be pulling out fish that look like this, horribly deformed and obviously not fit for human consumption. And it's always dangerous to, it's dangerous to try to provide cause and effect data. But what is true is that there's been a 30% increase in cancer rates in Fort Chipewyan, which is downstream from the Alberta tar sands. There's been a 30% increase in cancer rates from 1995 to 2006. It's an Athabascan people, Dene, D-E-N-E, who, not to be confused with Dene, which is what the Navajo people call themselves. This is a different community. But this community of people lives in Fort Chipewyan, downstream from the mills, the industrial complex. Biliary tract cancers, blood and lymphatic cancers are much higher than would be expected in a village of 1,100. There are 3 cases of this very rare carcinoma where you would expect to see 1 or 2 cases in 200,000 population. There are 3 cases in this tiny town of 1,100. So the community there has every reason to believe that there's a cause and effect relationship between the toxins that are being poured into their river and the fish and other animals in the food chain that they're depending upon for their diet. The second community is Black Mesa, and this is a coal mine that was run by Peabody Coal beginning in the 1960s. If you know where the Grand Canyon is in Arizona, Black Mesa is northeast of Flagstaff and east of the Grand Canyon. So here's the chronology of Black Mesa. In 1964, Peabody Coal signed a contract with the Navajo, and then 2 years later with the Hopi. This is a really long and complicated legal struggle that I won't get into now, but I will say that the Hopi were reluctant partners. And had they not agreed to mine, the Navajo would have gotten 100% of the mining proceeds. So the Hopi were basically left with either mine and get half the proceeds or not mine and get nothing. So in 1966, the Hopi agreed to this contract with Peabody Coal to slurry coal to Los Angeles, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Tucson. And at the time, the company promised to take 1 teacup of water per day from the N aquifer. Well, from 1970 to 2005, Peabody actually took 40 billion gallons, 3,700 acre feet of water per year from the N aquifer. In 2005, it stopped the slurry operations, but the mine continued to provide coal to the Navajo generating station. That was the name of the generating station. It wasn't a Navajo-owned enterprise. In that time, the surface waters began to dry up. The Hopi and Navajo nations sued. Company hydrologists said the surface and groundwater systems were not connected, and they maintained that the surface water problems were drought related. And it's true, there has been a drought in that area. But whether that was the sole reason for the diminished aquifer is, up for debate. The mine and the Navajo generating station shut down at the end of 2019. Nearly 1,000 workers lost their job. 90% of them Native American, almost all of them Navajo. The Navajo Nation estimates that it will lose $30 million in annual revenue. And meanwhile, there are activists on the Hopi and Navajo reservations that are pushing for renewable energy. This is an area that gets a lot of sunlight, and there's no reason why wind farms and solar farms couldn't provide some of the energy the community needs. Meanwhile, the private and community wells are drying up. The water level in one well, 32 miles south of the mine, declined 17 feet from 1972 to 1979. The photo on the right is of Mervyn Yautawa, who is a Hopi elder and someone we spent a lot of time with. I take my graduate students to a Native community each winter as part of Medill's experiential learning program called Medill Explores. And for 2 years, 3 years ago and 2 years ago, I took students to the Hopi, Navajo, and Zuni communities. And Mervyn was one of our docents, I guess. He stayed with us on all of our field trips, and he's walking to a well that he uses. He has to drive about 35 miles to the well. The entire Hopi reservation was under a water advisory when we were there because of increased arsenic levels. And well, I'll get to that in just a second. The models from the USGS water supply folks indicated that if the usage of the aquifer stayed below 35% of the inflow, the aquifer would be able to sustain itself. But those models assumed that the mining would end in 2001. It didn't end in 2001, it ended in 2019, and it didn't account for drought conditions. And what's happened, and this was what we found on the Hopi reservation, is that because the aquifer was diminished and because the water table was lowered, the concentrations of arsenic, which is a naturally occurring element in the landscape, along with uranium, because the water table had been lowered, the concentrations of arsenic were really dense, and the water was not potable when we were there. And we stayed at the Hopi-owned reservation, and there were signs everywhere and tape over all the faucets saying, "Don't drink the water." You can imagine what that does to the Hopi economy and just to the quality of life of Hopi people. And one of my students, this photo was one that appeared in the Progressive magazine, which ran a story about arsenic in Hopi water called "It Eats You." And I can provide a link to that. It's a really good history of the area and the current threat and realities that the Hopi people are living with. One of the other legacies is uranium. This is a promotional video from the Kerr-McGee company. And this is after the Atomic Energy Department, the precursor of the Energy Department. They knew that there were risks associated with radiation exposure. And there had been recommendations. The company had been told that their workers needed protective gear. It didn't happen. And so these Navajo uranium miners were continuously exposed to radiation, and they would come back and come home at night with irradiated clothes and shoes and track radiated dust into their homes. A lot of people built their hogans, which were ceremonial spaces, alongside their houses. They would build them out of spent rocks from the mines. And I shared a resource that I'm hoping that somebody will put into chat for an excellent documentary called Return of Navajo Boy. A documentarian by the name of Jeff Spitz, who teaches here at Columbia College in Chicago, produced this excellent documentary that actually he was the one that found this promotional video in the archives, and it was actually entered into a lawsuit filed by the Navajo and a number of other complainants in this American Southwest, and resulted in a $1 billion judgment. But some of that went to the lawyers and tried to clean up 500 abandoned uranium mines with $1 billion, and it's not going to go very long. The money's not going to go very far. But there's a legacy of radiation poisoning and pulmonary health issues. And Congress actually passed a congressional act that awarded damages to Navajo miners, but initially did not include Navajo who drove the trucks or worked with processed uranium, who were also suffering these health effects. It initially just covered the miners, and then it was expanded to include other workers involved in the uranium industry. I want to talk about the worst radioactive spill in US history. Now, most people would think that it's 3 Mile Island. However, it actually was Church Rock, New Mexico, and 3 months after 3 Mile Island. And really horrifying environmental disaster. Here's the chronology of that. The United Nuclear Corporation Church Rock Uranium Mill tailings pond breached its dam, sending 1,100 tons of radioactive waste into the Rio Puerco River, 93 million gallons of effluent. This was so far-reaching, 80 miles downstream, the levels were 7,000 times higher than background levels. Residents weren't warned. A lot of them waded into the water, complained of burning feet, taken to the hospital with heat stroke. Livestock died. Only 1% of the radioactive materials were recovered. The company trucked in water until 1981. That was supposed to be when this whole thing was cleaned up. It wasn't cleaned up. It's still not cleaned up. Farmers had no choice but to begin using the water, from the river again. 40 years later, it's still not cleaned up. And when we talk about sacrifice zones, I mean, look at this. 3 Mile Island residents, 3 Mile Island being predominantly white, each complainant received an average 3.3 million. Church Rock residents received $2,000. And then the third sacrifice zone I want to talk about is Enbridge Line 5. And if you could see from the map, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not. So this is crude oil from the tar sands that goes from Superior. This area right here, this is my reservation on the south shore of Lake Superior. These are our rice beds right up here along this the point, this really marshy land. It cuts right across our reservation through Upper Michigan, through the Upper Peninsula, and then continues. It crosses the Straits of Mackinac, and this is a real problem here, and then continues, and then the terminus is back in Ontario. So, this is a Canadian pipeline that is basically using US land to transport its crude oil from Canada to Canada, and the Indigenous tribes along the route in the states of Wisconsin and Michigan are bearing all the risk and not getting any of the rewards. They're not sharing in the oil in any way. So here's what it looks. Here's a little close-up. This is my reservation here. The pipeline is 645 miles long. It's a 30-inch pipe transporting 2.3 million gallons per day, built in 1953 and had a 50-year life expectancy. That was 18 years ago. And then the pipeline has had what the company calls anomalies, what we like to call leaks and ruptures. And it's crossing rivers, it's crossing our wild rice beds, our wetlands, and culturally significant areas. Here's a little chronology. In early January 2017, I have to back up a little bit because I know most of you won't know much about Native American history and land policy, but Native people don't, first of all, we don't own our land. It's held in trust for us by the federal government, which wanted to assimilate us in the 19th century and passed, in the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, and passed something called the Allotment Act in 1887. And it basically was trying to privatize the reservation and turn the Native people living on the reservations into farmers. And so the land was allotted, meted out, parceled out with, in my case, my grandfather received 90 acres of land, and his allotment had non-Native people who acquired land through the Homestead Act and received free land that had agreed to farm the land on either side of him, so that I guess the plan was to have my grandfather be inspired by the good Protestant farmers working next to him and become a farmer and not be a hunter-gatherer, fisher person. So what happened was that, not surprisingly, the land quickly passed from Native to non-Native hands. And in the case of my reservation, we lost 40% of our land to non-Indians. So we have a lot of non-Indians living on our reservation. Some reservations, like the Oneida, lost 95% of their land. So we actually were one of the luckier tribes. But what's happened is there's this polyglot of jurisdiction, and these allotments that the tribe is trying to buy back. And over time, we acquired some private land that had easements that had been negotiated. The private landowners had negotiated easements with Enbridge for this pipeline, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs basically rubber stamped the pipeline running through our reservation. So in 2013, these easements, the contracts were up, and my tribal council began pressuring Enbridge they wanted the pipeline gone, and Enbridge wasn't willing to do that. And after 3.5 years of failed negotiations, my tribal council unanimously voted not to renew the easements. It ordered Enbridge to decommission and remove the pipe. Over the next couple of years, Enbridge asked for outside mediation and offered my tribe $3.25 million to renew the easements. We refused. Since then, Enbridge keeps upping the offer, and by the end of last year, it was up to $24 million. And you have to understand, Bad River, if it's not, it's one of the poorest, if not the poorest tribe in Wisconsin. And $24 million is a lot of money. And yet, the people are really of one mind. We don't want this pipeline there. So last year, the council sued Enbridge. And then Enbridge said, well, then we'll go around the reservation and began condemnation proceedings, which it filed and then withdrew the condemnation application because it was able to negotiate leases with private landowners to go around our reservation. Everything, you have to understand, this area is upland, so everything drains north into Lake Superior. If there's a leak here, it's still going to affect us. And, the tribe is of one mind, that it doesn't want the pipeline anywhere near our area, but we don't have any kind of power over that. Meanwhile, in Michigan, in 2018, an anchor from a tugboat in the Straits of Mackinac struck the pipeline, damaging but not rupturing it. The company then reached agreement with the GOP governor to build a tunnel for the pipeline under the Straits. There was an election, the Republicans were voted out, a new Democratic administration took over, and in June of last year, the Democratic Attorney General sued Enbridge, wanting to shut it down. There's a little bit of fuel to the fire. Michigan released a risk management study. At the very least, it said a leak in this part of the Straits of Mackinac, because there's so much water pressure there. It's where, Lake Huron and Lake Michigan converge. The estimates are that if a leak would happen there, if the pipeline ruptured, the oil would flow in all directions at all levels, and it would be an absolute nightmare. So close to 2 billion would be the absolute minimum of potential damages, and Enbridge didn't have that kind of money. They'd need funds from their parent Canadian company. So even as we speak, Michigan is holding public hearings on the tunnel permits for Line 5. So it's not all before you reach, if there are any Indigenous people in this Zoom audience, before you reach for any sharp objects, we do have some legal tools available to us. Sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty refers to the right of American Indians and Alaska Natives to govern themselves. The US Constitution recognizes us. We're not just a community of color like African Americans or Latinx or Asian Americans. We have a political legal identity. We're sovereign. We're sovereign enough to be coerced into signing treaties to give up our land. And the US Constitution recognizes that we are distinct governments with the right to regulate our internal affairs. We have treaty rights, and the federal government is the entity in the separation of powers. The federal government is the entity that has it only has the authority to negotiate treaties with Indian nations or any foreign nation. The Constitution, Article 6 says, the laws of the United States shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States are the supreme law of the land. And the US Supreme Court has affirmed this again and again and again, that these Indian treaties, even though they don't expire, there's no expiration date, they were signed in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, they're still valid. And we learned that as recently as a couple of months ago with the McGirt decision in Oklahoma. Treaty rights are still valid. My own nation signed an 1837 treaty, and this is the kind of language you see in those treaties. The privilege of hunting, fishing, and gathering the wild rice upon the lands, the rivers, and lakes included in the territory ceded is guaranteed to the Indians. So we have rights. I mean, we were forced to cede millions of acres of land to the federal government for what became the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, or at least parts of them. But we have the right to hunt, fish, and gather in those ceded territories even today. The Supreme Court, realizing that Native negotiators were at a disadvantage in these treaty negotiations with federal negotiators who were writing down the minutes and drafting the understandings, realized, okay, the Indians are at a disadvantage. So now modern courts have adopted these canons. Ambiguous expressions must be resolved in favor of the Indian parties concerned. Indian treaties have to be interpreted as the Indians themselves would have understood them. Indian treaties must be liberally construed in favor of Indians. So these evolved over time in the early 19th century. They were liberally used in the 1960s, and courts have been kind of retreating from them since the late 1970s, although McGirt was an unequivocal statement in support of tribal sovereignty. This is an interesting law that sometimes comes into play with environmental issues, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This is an act that protects burial sites or cultural artifacts inadvertently excavated on federal or tribal lands. Highway gets constructed, they come across a cultural site, and the tribal historic preservation officers are called, and there's a process for dealing with whatever is found at that site. There's a process for returning cultural items held by public institutions. For example, if the Field Museum has human remains and they can determine who they belong to, they have to give them back. And there's penalties for trafficking in human remains. I just found this out this morning in a meeting I had, that Illinois actually has the highest number of unreturned human remains, 13,000, almost 14,000 human remains, and only 270 bodies have been returned since the law was passed in 1990. So there's a lot of work to be done there. This is an important one, and these treatment as a state or treatment as a sovereign, TAS, in the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts is something that you may encounter as an environmental engineer. This is regulatory authority, including over non-Indians on a reservation, may be delegated to an Indian nation under the Clean Air, Clean Water Act. We like to think of it as the United States not having the right to delegate anything, but acknowledging that we're sovereign enough where we should have this regulatory authority. It's a very onerous process, but it is an environmental protection for tribes that are concerned about extraction industries. Like we invoked TAS, which was helpful to us in turning back what would have been a 22-mile long open pit taconite mine at the headwaters of our Wild Rice River about 4 years ago. So an Indian nation with TAS is treated the same as a state for purposes of the Clean Air, Clean Water Act. There's a tension that gets set up because tribes generally set that have TAS generally set air and water quality standards that are higher than the states in which they reside. Legally, the federal government says those standards can't be any higher than the federal standards, but almost certainly they exceed the state standards, and that sets up all kinds of potential lawsuits. You know, in the case of the Bad River Ojibwe, the Menominee, the Oneida, and several other tribes that were trying to turn back pipeline threats and gold mining threats and sulfide mines for copper and silver. The state of Wisconsin almost constantly sued and tried to file for injunctions. Traditional cultural property is an interesting legal tool. So traditional TCP is a location associated with the traditional beliefs of a Native American group about its origins, its cultural history, or the nature of the world, or a location where Native American religious practitioners have historically gone and are known or thought to go to today to perform ceremonial activities in accordance with traditional cultural rules of practice. The interesting Achilles heel in TCP is who pays for it. The company that wants to do something in a traditional cultural property has the onus of paying for it. So they're hiring the experts that investigate whether a place is a traditional cultural property or not. And in one case, the Red Cliff Ojibwe, which is a tribe just north of mine, is along Lake Superior. And as a legacy of the old mining days, there were all these really beautiful submerged white pine logs in the area along their shoreline. And there was a company that made very high-end musical instruments, guitars and violins, the Superior Underwater Logging Company, that wanted to harvest the logs out of the lake because it's cold water and the wood was preserved. And the logging the logging years were basically from 1880 to 1920, but the logs were intact. And Red Cliff said, no, we don't want you to do that, because now that, you know, those logs have become fish habitat and they're part of the ecosystem and we don't want them disturbed. So Red Cliff filed for protection under this Traditional Cultural Property Act. And so the Superior Logging Company hired an anthropologist to go interview and investigate whether in fact the south shore of Lake Superior was in fact a traditional cultural property. So the anthropologist went and interviewed a bunch of people on the reservation and filed a report that said, nope, not a traditional cultural property. There isn't any religion, you know, any religious practices going on here, because the Red Cliff Ojibwe don't have a religion, which absolutely blew everybody's mind, because, you know, there are these ancient religions there and people definitely have a spiritual tradition, but, you know, the tribe got no protection under TCP because this company had hired somebody to investigate what it knew it wanted to. I mean, it knew the results before it began the investigation. So TCP hasn't been really helpful to a lot of tribes. So here are some resources. I've shared this with Erin Packman and Tierney. So if you're interested in learning more about any of the topics that I've mentioned, here it is. And I will say thank you and stop sharing. And I neglected to ask how long you wanted me to talk, Erin, but I have a timer going. It says I've talked for 35 minutes, and I think that's maybe a good time to stop and see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Patty. Yes, so I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. The talk was very interesting and very broad. So I will turn it over to the audience to see if there are any questions.
Or comments, or anecdotes you want to share.
How do you want to handle the questions?
We can have people, well, let's see, it's challenging. There's 127 people.
Holy smokes.
Which means I can't see easily if people raise their hands. So could you put either a request to ask a question or a question directly into the chat window?
Yeah.
And I'll relay it.
Okay.
And in the meantime, I have a comment actually.
Okay.
And it's on the first one you showed, the oil sands, tar sands extraction. It's one of the worst projects I've ever seen. One of my colleagues in Environment Canada is responsible for the sediment monitoring, and it's just tremendously destructive everywhere downstream.
Yeah, and you know, the energy to take that oil, that crude oil out of the tar sands, the energy that's expended, I've read, and I'm a historian, so I'm a humanities person, and you know, I'll defer to more scientific minds than mine. But as I understand it, just as much, if not more, energy is going into extraction than is actually useful energy coming out. So you just have to wonder why would anybody want to do that? And the environmental destruction is just horrific. Not to mention the effect on the lives of the Indigenous people of the area.
So there's a comment from Susan Alexis. Do you want to unmute yourself and talk with Patty?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Patty. I just wanted to thank you for including that bit about at the end discussing the laws and whatnot. I think a lot of us who are American have been exposed to some extent, like the recent case and whatnot of these things that happen and we hear about in the news. But it was interesting for me to see specifically like what aspects affect, what laws affect what areas, and to see how it actually plays out. So I just wanted to thank you for including that part.
Oh, thank you. I'm seeing a lot of action in chat here. Let me, the fact that Bad River has remained so cohesive in the face of increasing pressure is interesting and inspiring. What is promoting the cohesion, environmental concerns, shared beliefs? You know, I think it's because we have, and it's not just the Ojibwe, but I think, you know, we call it a 7th generation ethic, and it's called different things in, you know, by different Native communities, but it's this, and it's always dangerous to paint Native people with a broad brush. You know, we're definitely not monolithic, but it's this, you know, ethic of land stewardship. And for us, we're really raised with this idea that we have an obligation to make decisions today based on the best interests of the generations 7 into the future. So we are really taught to think long-term, our you know, the great-grandchildren of our great-grandchildren. And when, you know, you contrast that with mainstream society, you know, which is so short-term, you know, our election cycles are on 2 years. Our business cycles are quarterly, you know, and if you don't make your profits, you know, you got a golden parachute and you're out of there after just 3 months. And when we think about the really wicked problems, climate change, you know, clean air, clean water, conservation, preservation, I mean, these are efforts that require really long-term vision. And in that 7th generation thinking, when we're looking into the future, it also is a way for us to look back, because the treaty rights that were signed in, you know, 1837, that's, you know, my great maybe 3 grades, signed 2 of those 3 treaty sessions. So it's really personal for me. And a long time, I was embarrassed and ashamed that one of my relatives actually sold the land, you know, the Ojibwe lost and the federal government gained. And then as I matured, I realized the treaties were so coercive. Everybody was forced to sign those those land cession treaties. The fact that he and others had it was brilliant that they reserved those treaty rights that my generation is still using and my children and my grandchildren are going to be using. So yeah, I think that is such a strong environmental ethic. And people, if you spend any time at Bad River, you know, you won't see a lot of development. People live really simply, but you know, and it's still a gift economy in a lot of ways. The people that share rice with everybody who, you know, can't rice anymore. People that take deer are sharing, you know, deer meat with people that don't hunt anymore, young families where, you know, they need more food. So, you know, that kind of gift economy still exists. And I think that really contributes to the environmental ethic that has led to the community being absolutely unanimously opposed to this pipeline, and the ability to turn away $24 million, I think is pretty interesting. So how is it that whoever made that assessment about the cultural site has the authority to do so? Wouldn't that be considered a conflict of interest if the company hired the anthropologist who had a stake in the game? Absolutely, but this is the way the federal law is written. And I'm sure somebody thought, well, these tribes are so poor, they're not going to be able to hire anthropologists to defend themselves. So, you know, we should put the onus on the company. Well, yeah, it was well conceived, but poorly executed, I think. Okay, is there any hope for environmental justice that can happen from tribes themselves? There's a huge concern over blood quantum and getting descendants enrolled and protected by these treaties. Can you speak to that? What a great question. And yeah, you know, blood quantum is a holdover from the really early treaties where there were already mixed bloods in the community, particularly in the Western Great Lakes region. Our ancestors intermarried with French fur traders. And in fact, we have a clan that, because we're patriarchal, we have a clan that is specially designed for the children of mixed marriages between the French and Indigenous women. So when those treaties were signed, the federal government negotiators decided that, well, once somebody gets to 25%, you know, lower than 25% blood quantum, then they're not really Indian anymore. And we don't have to pay them the annuities in the treaties. So over time, a lot of the tribes just kept that arbitrary determination of who's Native and who's not. And for a while, our tribal governments were dissolved, and the federal government, you know, was our great white father. And eventually in 1934, we were able to reconstitute our governments again, but that 25% blood quantum still stuck. Well, you know, our communities are really small, and there's only 1,100 people that live on the Bad River Reservation. So you think about, you know, the marriageable generation, there's not a lot to pick from. So, you know, a lot of, frequently, Native people are marrying outside their tribe. You don't want to marry your cousin because everybody's related in a small community. So, you think about, if I'm half Ojibwe and because my father's German, my mother's Ojibwe, if my children are 25% and they marry outside the tribe, their children are not going to be Native enough to be considered a legal Indian. But we have a lot of Native children who are 1/8 Lakudere Ojibwe, 1/8 Ojibwe, 1/8 or Bad River Ojibwe, 1/8 Ho-Chunk, 1/8 Menominee. They might be 100% Indian in terms of blood quantum, but they're not Indian enough in any single tribe in order to be considered native or to have any of the benefits that accrue to being Indian. So they won't have treaty rights, they won't have voting rights, they won't be citizens of a sovereign nation. And this is really troubling. And so now Native nations are scrambling to come up with a different way to figure out who our people are. And some of them are just lowering the blood quantum and saying, well, if you're an 1/8, then you're Indian. Well, that's just, the genocide is on the horizon, and that path is just going to lead to our disappearance. So some tribes are going to lineal descendancy. Some are recognizing that descent in a number of different tribes would constitute membership. They can't be a member of more than one tribes, but at least a citizen of more than one tribes. But they're already thinking that we have to do things differently. And if you're going to be a sovereign nation, we have the right to naturalize our citizens, right? And that's something that makes a lot of people really uncomfortable, because that TAS that I mentioned earlier, we have the right to, and I want to make sure I'm not going too long here. I'm trying to keep track of the time. That TAS that we have means that if, Aaron, you moved to Bad River and you had, if you had a septic system that was failing, we legally have the right to tell you, you need to put in a $69,000 mound system and clean up your water. Well, you as a non-native could, very easily go to court and say, well, I don't have any due process. I'm not a citizen, and yet, and I can't attend tribal meetings. And so this is an area that, especially in the Constitution of the court now, we don't want to go there. We're not pressing our environmental authority because we're really concerned that if we do, we're going to have another slice of our sovereignty, chipped off the block. I kind of rambled there.
Okay, it was very
It's
interesting.
really interesting, though.
Yeah. I suggest you take the question from Julia Kaminsky. Speaking for students, a lot of the students will start working with companies in these industries after graduation. So as individuals, what can people do to avoid perpetuating the problems or destruction that these companies are causing?
Wow, what a great question, Julia. It's a big question too. I think, I don't think that corporations are necessarily destructive, that they intend to, wreak environmental disaster. I also think that Native Americans sometimes lie outside of their cultural comfort zone, and most corporations don't really know how to approach. They don't have the right language. And so having, diversity training that's Native specific is really helpful. Using words like nation and not tribe. I kind of I'll use tribe and band and nation interchangeably. But if you go into meet Native negotiators, using words like sovereignty and thinking about your project in terms of how can you affirm sovereignty goes a long way. And diversifying your own company, having a diverse board of directors is really helpful. And maybe creating, a position like a tribal liaison would be helpful. And then I think inviting people, Native people to meet go to meet them in their community, but invite them to meet in your boardroom. Listen to them, understand, know their history, because a lot of Native communities are really suffering from generational trauma that's complicated, it's historic, and you know, a lot of these communities, you know, the only time they ever see somebody in a suit is when somebody shows up and they lose a little bit more of their land, or they lose their children, or, you know, so demystifying those relationships and using the right language and going in informed, I think, is really helpful.
There's another one on, you could say, lessons learned from George Wells. Are there any lessons learned from the Bad River Enbridge experience that can be applied to other pipelines, such as Dakota Access or Keystone? And second part, what can the environmental community and environmental engineering community do to aid communities that are impacted?
Yeah. And the first one, I got to go back and see the first one. Oh, lessons learned. Yeah. I think the most important lesson that my community has learned is that our fears and our aspirations are really not so different from the non-native communities around us. And that, you know, meeting people one-on-one, and we've been doing a lot of that. Our tribal chair has been a really good ambassador, goes to the local gun club and, you know, does skeet shooting with the locals, and talks to them about preserving their hunting rights, and you know, and what open pit taconite mining means, you know, what mountaintop removal looks like, and the fact that it's not just our culture, you know, the indigenous culture that'll be destroyed, but the culture of Wisconsin's North Woods for everybody is going to be destroyed. If there's a pipeline rupture, their children are going to have contaminated water along with ours. So that, you know, having a coalition, a broad coalition really helps. That's one thing. And then for the Northwestern environmental engineering community, there are so many nations that lack the scientific expertise that we need when, you know, an extraction industry comes in and wants to build a mine or extend a pipeline. You know, we have the lowest participation in the sciences, so we need allies. And you know, there are some really great Native nations and Native serving institutions and organizations that could use some interns, you know, with your kinds of skills. So, you know, Erin and Jennifer Dunn and some of the other good folks on your side of campus and I have been working to we've been doing some relationship building and learning about those opportunities. And I'll definitely try to do a better job of sending those opportunities out when a tribe is looking for some environmental engineering, or a Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission has internships, you know, open.
So that would be great, Patty. And actually, a number of us, Kimberly Gray and I and other people, we have provided technical assistance to community groups primarily in the city of Chicago and some other locations. So there are opportunities for faculty and students to get involved and provide technical expertise in support of legal briefs or technical review, sometimes of those company produced reports. So
yeah, and I think we forget sometimes that, you know, over 70% of Native people now live in cities, just like Chicago, and cities are environments too.
So just as a time check, it is 3 o'clock, and we could let whoever needs to go. Patty, would you be interested in staying a little longer to answer more questions?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Okay, so
I look in chat and see if, you know, what's there.
So maybe I think that Michael Goodkind had a question about members of Congress who speak up on behalf of Native Americans.
Yeah, we have two Native women, Deb Holland and I blanked on her name. The other congresswoman who are speaking up on issues. So far, they've really kind of focused on murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is a huge problem. But are also interested in environmental issues as well. I'm trying to think of I think there's one of the senators from Hawaii is pretty good, and the state of Washington, but it's just really not high on the congressional radar right now. And I think everybody is so distracted by the election that once things settle down, I think those issues will surface again. Right now, the present administration has never seen a pipeline it didn't like, and nothing but green lights ahead for Keystone and DAPL and Line 5, and that may change after November, and I won't say anything more about that. Non-political, but it could change, and then maybe those issues a bit back on the radar again.
There was a question from Emma Novak asking whether the recent Supreme Court ruling in Oklahoma that you mentioned would substantially change activities for other tribes and nations.
Another really good question today. Well, McGirt really focused on criminal jurisdiction in eastern Oklahoma and decided that, the treaties still held, and Oklahoma within that context was still Indian territory. But the implications could extend to environmental and other realms. And I think a lot of the tribes, including my own, saw that as just a really great ruling affirming treaty rights. We have our treaty rights were affirmed by the US Supreme Court in 1990 after a 25-year legal and very violent struggle over treaty rights. And so this, there are a couple of really bedrock rulings in environmental law. One is the Bolt decision in Washington State that informed the Voigt decision in Wisconsin that was affirmed by the Mille Lacs versus Minnesota case. And now McGirt is in another area, but they all at their center have, tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. And the fact that, courts that have been liberal and courts that have been conservative have upheld those treaty rights, I think is really significant. Interestingly enough,
Oops.
And I know when it comes to women and family and children's rights, she was not a good justice for Native American environmental rights, and in fact invoked the doctrine of discovery in a court case, Sherrill versus the Oneida Nation. And the Oneida lost a major land claims decision because of a ruling that actually Ginsburg wrote. She wrote the majority opinion. So it's been really interesting to think about what this new court, if it's a 6-3 conservative majority, will that benefit Native people? Will it hurt us? We don't really know. States' rights justices tend to not look so kindly at Native American rights because there's often this tension between tribes and the states over environmental regulation. But I fully expected that McGirt would go the other way. So this is why I'm a journalist and not a lawyer, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a question that was related to your comment about some of these issues affecting broader communities, not only the Native communities, from Melissa Reimer. So she indicated that her family owns a property that's 5 miles from line 5 and had no idea that there was such a big risk associated with that. The question is, what's the solution to that? Is the solution renewable energy or something else?
Well, I think that's what my tribe is standing tough on. You know, we have the Great Lakes in our area, which are potential sources of energy. Solar energy probably, well, solar energy could work, geothermal energy in some places. We just want, I think anybody who's reasonable understands that we can't keep going the way we're going with fossil fuels. And unless we don't want a planet that we can inhabit, we've got to start thinking differently. And, you know, I fear when I look back at my life and see, you know, when major change happens, it's because we all realize the alternative, there's no other alternative but to change. We can't do things the way we've always been doing them. You look at World War II, how quickly we changed from a civilian industrial nation to, you know, producing weapons. I mean, it was so quick. And then we shifted just as quick back after the war. Nobody had any houses to live in. So we built housing at an incredible rate to accommodate all these returning soldiers and the, you know, the baby boom that happened in my generation. We can do anything we set our mind to, I think. But we hold on until, you know, we don't see any other way forward. And I wonder what more it's going to take. How many more forest fires? How many more floods? You know, how many more Category 4 hurricanes is going to take before we all say, you know what? Maybe there really is this thing, you know, called climate change, and now it's affecting me, and now I'm willing to change my way of thinking. I don't think that really answered the question, but I feel better for getting it off my chest.
Well, does anybody want to follow up on that? Or try to see who asked the original question?
So that was Jeff Reimer who did. I'm not sure if he's still on, but he's just using his wife's. You know, one thing that discussion brings up, and I think it also goes with the pipeline issues, those pipeline decisions and then construction take years, right? They take decades. They get kicked around for such a long time. You also made a similar comment about how things are in the courts for just generations.
25 years.
Yeah, they'll just be generations, and you almost forget about the, you know, the origination by the time there's a decision. There's been so many different changes. So it will be interesting with renewable energy or just, you know, climate response in general, if there'll just be an inflection point, and then at some point things will happen more rapidly, because for most of these things, they don't happen rapidly, right?
No.
They're torturous decisions. We go one direction and there's an election and we can just flip back, you know, in another direction. I mean, climate being one of them, right? We make good climate decisions slowly and then they get all reversed in a very short period of time.
Right.
So,
absolutely.
yeah, I don't know. I like your optimism, but I fear just the inertia of, you know, fossil fuels, for instance. I really fear, you made reference of the tar sands in Alberta. Like, that doesn't really make a huge amount of energy sense, and yet it goes forward.
Yeah, because the money is to be made in the
Short term. Yeah.
And, you know, we have overbuilt our pipelines and they're becoming these orphan assets. They don't make any economic sense, but it's just, you know, I mean, this is the way capitalism and consumerism goes. I mean, this is what we get. I watched this wonderful, I'm a huge David Attenborough fan, and there's a his documentary on Netflix right now, which is sort of his love letter to the planet and his memories of, you know, doing his nature-based research over the years. I think it's called Our Living Planet or something like that. And you know, my husband and I were both reaching for sharp objects because he, you know, was showing the loss of natural land, and of course all the, you know, the horrors of climate change. And we were just feeling like, oh my gosh, there's, you know, this is horrible, gloom and doom. And then he kind of turned it around and said, but we could do this and we could do that, and look at what's going on here. And Costa Rica had, you know, had lost 75% of its natural areas, and within 25 years now they, you know, because they've reclaimed and protection, conservation, they're down to 50% of land, or they've recovered 50% of land. And look at what the Dutch are doing with, you know, they've turned many of their big empty industrial warehouses now and are doing vertical urban agriculture and are supplying something like 70% of the European Union's produce now. And Morocco is creating these solar farms, and, you know, so there are these areas around the planet where people are doing things differently and are moving away from fossil fuels and using renewables. And it makes a lot of economic sense too. I mean, these are going to be really good jobs, good, clean jobs. If I'm a coal miner, why would I want to risk black lung disease and work, you know, in a dark space 8 hours a day when I could be out, you know, doing something with a wind farm or a solar farm? You know, I just think that you know, we just have to get rid of my generation, because the millennials have much more of an understanding and appreciation for social justice, for environmental justice. We just got to move my generation out of the seats of power in government and business and let them, you know, get on with what they want to do, because I think they're on the right track.
May I just have one quick question though about renewable energy? So a lot of renewable energy is very land intensive. Do you foresee a collision point with Native Americans along that issue? So, you know, many people don't want to see a wind turbine. It takes away from their, you know, their view or something. Do you think that might also be an issue? I mean, solar and wind can be, you know, are land intensive.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I haven't heard that so much in Indian country. And, you know, the students that I've taken to the Southwest, there's the tribes there are very interested in solar energy and are already getting into wind energy. The Potawatomi in Wisconsin have gone to 4-day work weeks. They replaced all their conventional lighting in their gaming operation in Milwaukee with LEDs. They've replaced all their mechanicals in all their tribal tribal buildings, and now they're generating 100% of their needs, and they're able to sell their excess energy to other entities. So you know, I hear what you're saying, but I haven't seen that yet. I don't think that conversation, I'm not hearing that conversation yet.
I'll throw it back to you, Aaron. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's 3:15, and I think we should probably wrap up. Thank Patty again. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Really, had I known that there were 160 people, I would have been. And
I think it's record attendance.
And edited myself a little bit more carefully.
No, it was perfect. Actually, there were several thanks that came through in the chat window, requests to post the recording and share it. So I think it's very successful. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And
Great.
we say Gigawabamen Minwa means thank you very much, and I'll see you later.